The transatlantic slave trade, spanning the 16th to 19th centuries, forcibly displaced approximately 12.5 million Africans to the Americas, driven by European demand for cheap labor. While Europeans orchestrated the trade's global framework, African societies, kings, chiefs, merchants, and middlemen played a critical role as suppliers of captives. Focusing on the goods African elites and traders accepted, how they valued captives, and the socio-economic dynamics that shaped these transactions. By exploring these elements, we gain insight into the complex motivations and systems that enabled African participation in one of history's most devastating enterprises. Unlike modern economies with standardized currencies, the transatlantic slave trade operated on a barter system. African societies did not use European coins or paper money. Instead, they exchanged captives for goods that held economic, social, or political value. These goods were carefully selected by African traders to meet local needs, enhance prestige, or bolster power. The primary items included European muskets, pistols, and gunpowder were among the most coveted goods. African states like Dahomey, Oyo, and Asante sought firearms to gain military superiority over rivals. For example, by the 18th century, Dahomey's army relied heavily on firearms acquired through the slave trade, creating a cycle where more captives were sold to obtain more weapons. European and Indian textiles, such as Manchester cloth, Indian calico, and silk, were highly valued for their quality and variety. These were used for clothing, trade, and as symbols of status. In the Gold Coast, for instance, Asante elites prized fine textiles for ceremonial purposes and as markers of wealth. Rum, gin, and brandy from Europe and the Americas were in demand, particularly among coastal elites. These were consumed in social and ritual contexts or traded inland. In the Bight of Biafra, Efik traders at Calabar often requested large quantities of rum as part of slave transactions. Iron bars, brass manillas, and copper rods were valued for crafting tools, weapons, and jewelry. Manillas, bracelet-like objects, became a form of currency in regions like the Niger Delta, used in both local and slave trade transactions. Imported from the Indian Ocean via European traders, cowrie shells were a widely accepted currency in West Africa, especially in the Bight of Biafra. They were used to purchase captives inland and as a medium of exchange in local markets. Beads, mirrors, and other trinkets were sought as prestige items. These were often used by elites to display wealth or distributed to solidify alliances. In Senegambia, glass beads were particularly valued in trade negotiations. African traders were discerning, rejecting low-quality goods and negotiating for items that met their needs. For example, in the 18th century, Gold Coast traders refused damaged textiles or inferior firearms, forcing Europeans to adjust their offerings. The valuation of captives in African societies was not standardized but varied by region, time, and the characteristics of the captives. Prices were expressed in notional units like bars, based on iron bars, or ounces, equivalent to the value of an ounce of gold in trade goods. African traders assessed captives based on age, sex, health, and market demand, with negotiations reflecting local power dynamics and European competition. Adult males, valued for their labor potential in the Americas, typically fetched the highest prices. Women were also sought for labor and reproductive roles, often priced slightly lower. Children commanded lower prices but were still traded, especially in regions like Angola. For example, in the 18th century Bight of Biafra, a healthy adult male might be valued at 50 to 100 manillas, while a woman or child could fetch 30 to 60 manillas. African traders ensured captives were healthy to maximize value, as Europeans rejected sick or weak individuals. Coastal middlemen often held captives in barracoons, holding pens, to assess their condition before sale. Prices differed across regions due to supply, demand, and local economies. In Senegambia, where supply was lower due to less centralized slave rating systems, a prime male captive in the late 18th century might be valued at goods worth £10, 15 sterling equivalent, paid in goods, not cash. In Dahomey, with its efficient military supply system, prices were lower, around £7.10 equivalent for a male captive. Prices fluctuated over time. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when the trade was less intense, a captive might be exchanged for goods worth 10 to 20 bars, e.g., a few yards of cloth, some iron bars, and alcohol. By the 18th century, peak demand drove prices higher. For instance, in the Bight of Benin, a male captive could fetch goods equivalent to 20 to 40 gallons of rum, several muskets, or a combination of textiles and gunpowder. African elites and merchants were not passive participants. They actively shaped the terms of trade. Coastal states like Dahomey and the Ephek of Calabar controlled access to captives, leveraging European competition to secure better deals. For example, when multiple European ships arrived at a port like Wita, African traders played them against each other to increase the quantity or quality of goods offered. Inland, African middlemen and rulers set prices based on local conditions. For instance, the Arrow Confederacy in Igboland coordinated slave raiding networks and negotiated prices in cowrie shells or metal goods before transporting captives to the coast. These middlemen often inflated prices to account for the risks and costs of inland transport. African rulers also imposed taxes or tributes on European traders, further influencing the trade's economics. In Dahomey, King Agaja, r. 1718 to 1740, required European traders to pay customs duties in goods, such as cowries or textiles, to access the market. This ensured that African elites extracted maximum value from the trade. The goods received in exchange for captives transformed African economies and societies. Firearms fueled militarization, enabling states like Dahomey and Oyo to expand through conquest, which in turn produced more captives. Textiles and luxury goods reinforced social hierarchies, as elites used them to display wealth and reward followers. Cowrie shells and manillas integrated into local economies, facilitating trade beyond the slave market. However, this influx of goods created dependency. States that relied on European firearms became entangled in a cycle of violence, needing to capture more slaves to maintain their arsenals. The widespread use of cowries led to inflation in some regions, as their value declined with oversupply. For example, in the 18th century Bight of Biafra, the value of cowrie shells dropped as Europeans flooded the market, forcing African traders to demand more shells per captive. African participation was driven by economic and political incentives, shaped by the value of trade goods. Economic gain. Goods like textiles, cowries, and alcohol were reinvested into local economies, enriching elites and middlemen. For example, Ephek traders in Calabar used trade profits to expand their commercial networks. Political power. Firearms enabled states to dominate rivals, consolidating power. The Asante Empire, for instance, used slave trade profits to centralize authority and fund military campaigns. Coercion and survival. Refusing to participate risked military disadvantage, as rivals armed with European weapons could overrun non-participating states. This dynamic pressured even reluctant rulers to engage. Social prestige. Luxury goods like beads and textiles enhanced the status of chiefs and merchants, reinforcing their authority within communities. While African traders profited, the trade's human toll was immense. The loss of millions of people disrupted families, economies, and social structures. The influx of European goods reshaped African societies, often deepening inequalities and fueling conflict. The legacy of this period remains a sensitive topic, as it highlights the complicity of some African elites within a system driven by European demand. From the African perspective, the transatlantic slave trade was a complex economic system where captives were exchanged for goods like firearms, textiles, alcohol, cowries, and metal goods. African elites and merchants actively negotiated prices, leveraging European competition to maximize returns. Valuation varied by region, time, and captive characteristics, with prices reflecting local supply and demand. While these transactions brought wealth and power to some, they entrenched cycles of violence and dependency, with devastating consequences for African societies. Understanding the currency and pricing mechanisms reveals the agency of African actors within a tragic global system, underscoring the intricate interplay of economics, power, and human cost.